It started as a dream: purchase a sprawling colonial home nestled in Gates Mills, Ohio, with tall windows that flooded the rooms with golden afternoon light. When James and Lillian Carter bought the house in early 2025, they thought they had found their forever home. The property had once belonged to the late Eric Carmen, the legendary singer-songwriter known for hits like All by Myself and Hungry Eyes. The realtor assured them it was just a quiet estate, nothing more than a piece of music history frozen in time. But the house wasn't quiet. James noticed it first. A faint humming in the middle of the night, drifting through the halls like an old radio left on in another room. Lillian dismissed it, chalking it up to the wind or the settling of the old wooden beams. Then, the music became clearer melodies without lyrics, unfinished compositions that seemed to float through the air. The couple searched for a source, but nothing explained it. No hidden speakers, no faulty wiring. The melodies would start at odd hours, always after dark, and seemed to come from the grand piano in the sitting room. Yet, when James opened the lid, the keys were still. Lillian, an avid skeptic, grew uneasy when she began waking up at 3 a.m. to the sound of distant singing. Soft, mournful notes, as if someone were rehearsing in the dead of night. The sound was unmistakable, a voice eerily similar to Carmen's, carrying through the halls. One evening, they invited friends over, hoping to prove to themselves that it was just their imagination. The group laughed and poured drinks, turning the eerie rumors into a joke. But then, as the night wore on, the stereo turned on by itself. A single song played, Never Gonna Fall in Love Again. No one had touched the system. The laughter died. The guests left in a rush. Determined to find answers, James and Lillian researched the house's history. They discovered that Carmen had spent his final years there, writing music that was never released. His personal studio remained untouched, a relic of his creative process. Locals whispered that he had often spoken of melodies that came to him in dreams, music that haunted him even in life. Lillian, once skeptical, started keeping a journal. She documented flickering lights, cold spots, and the occasional scent of cigarette smoke lingering in the hallways, though neither she nor James smoked. The final straw came one stormy night when James, unable to sleep, wandered downstairs. As he passed by the piano, he froze. The air felt heavy, electric. Then, a single note rang out. He turned, his breath catching in his throat. There, in the dim reflection of the glass cabinet, was a shadowy figure sitting at the piano bench. A man with dark, tousled hair, his fingers hovering over the keys. James stumbled backward, his pulse hammering. In the blink of an eye, the figure was gone. They moved out within a month. The house remains empty now, its windows dark and silent. But locals say that on certain nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint strains of a melody drifting through the air, music from a songwriter who never truly left. The house stood empty for weeks after James and Lillian Carter left, its grand windows gazing out over the rolling Ohio landscape like vacant eyes, watching but never speaking. Dust gathered in the corners of the rooms, settling over the elegant furnishings they had abandoned in their hurry to leave. The piano remained where it had always been, its polished surface reflecting only the dim light that filtered through the heavy curtains, untouched yet never silent. The realtor tried to list the house again, lowering the price, rewording the description, historic estate with music legacy, but the whispers had already begun. Small-town rumors traveled quickly, twisting through Gates Mills like ivy. Some said the house was cursed, that the spirit of the singer lingered, trapped in melodies no one else could complete. Others dismissed the tales as foolishness, the result of an overactive imagination and the power of suggestion. But those who had been inside, even briefly, spoke of an unsettling presence. It was nearly autumn when the next owners arrived. Mark and Evelyn Holloway had spent most of their lives in the city, craving space and quiet now that their children were grown. Mark was a writer, drawn to the idea of working in solitude, while Evelyn, a former music teacher, had always dreamed of a house with a piano room. The Carmen house, despite its reputation, was perfect. The price was too good to ignore, and though the realtor hesitated when they asked about the previous owners, she said little beyond the usual. They decided to move closer to family. Evelyn was the first to notice the strange things. She had always been sensitive to sound, able to pick out the slightest imperfection in a note, the faintest hesitation in a piece of music. On their first night in the house, as she unpacked boxes in the sitting room, she felt it a tremor in the air, almost imperceptible, like the echo of a distant chord still lingering long after the last note had been played. She turned, expecting to hear Mark calling her, but there was only silence. The house, though vast, was suddenly too still, as if waiting. The next day, she sat at the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys. The instrument was perfectly tuned, despite having been left untouched for months. She played a few chords, let them hang in the air. As the sound faded, she thought she heard something else, something underneath the music, a whisper of harmony, following her melody like an unseen hand guiding hers. Mark dismissed it when she told him. Old houses make sounds, he reminded her. It's just the acoustics. But as the days passed, the feeling grew stronger. Evelyn found herself drawn to the piano, unable to resist the way it called to her, the way it seemed to hum even when no one was playing. At night, when the house was dark and the wind rattled the branches outside, she would wake to the sound of faint music drifting through the halls. Mark, deep in his writing, remained oblivious. He spent long hours in the study, absorbed in his work, brushing off Evelyn's unease with a reassuring squeeze of her hand. It wasn't until he, too, began to notice things, the occasional flickering of the lights, the creak of footsteps in the hallway when no one was there, that he started to wonder if the stories held more truth than he wanted to admit. Then came the night Evelyn played a song she had never learned. She had been sitting at the piano, lost in thought, her fingers idly pressing the keys. A melody took shape beneath her hands, unfamiliar yet instinctive, as if she had known it all along. The notes came effortlessly, flowing like water, filling the room with a haunting, bittersweet beauty. It wasn't until she reached the final chords that she realized she had no memory of how the song had begun. A chill ran through her. She turned, expecting to see Mark watching her, but she was alone. The silence that followed was heavier than before. The air itself seemed to hum, charged with something unseen. Evelyn's fingers hovered over the keys, her breath caught in her throat. Then, in the reflection of the piano's polished surface, she saw movement. A shadow just behind her, watching. She spun around, but the room was empty. Mark found her minutes later, still sitting at the piano, her hands shaking. She tried to explain, but the words felt inadequate, too small for the weight of what she had experienced. That night, neither of them slept. The house was awake. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The house had changed. Or perhaps it had always been this way, waiting for someone to listen. In the days that followed Evelyn's strange experience at the piano, an unease settled over the holloways like an unshakable fog. It wasn't just the music anymore. There were other things, small, almost insignificant on their own, but impossible to ignore once noticed. The way the temperature would drop in certain rooms, even when the heating was on. The scent of something faintly sweet, like old cologne, lingering in the hallways. The way the heavy velvet curtains in the sitting room would ripple as though touched by an unseen hand, even when the windows were shut tight against the autumn wind. Evelyn stopped playing the piano. She avoided it now, though she didn't tell Mark why. It wasn't fear, exactly, but something close to it, a quiet dread curling in the pit of her stomach every time she passed the instrument. She could still feel the weight of unseen eyes watching whenever she stood too near. More than once, she caught herself humming the unfamiliar melody, the one she had played without knowing how. The notes came unbidden, as though they had carved a space inside her, refusing to leave. Mark tried to distract her. He filled the days with small renovations, painting the study, repairing the loose stair rail, replacing the dim, flickering light fixtures. He told himself the house was just old, that old houses had stories, but they were only stories. Then, one night, the music came again. It was past midnight when Evelyn woke, her breath shallow, her pulse quickening before she was even fully aware of why. The room was cold, the kind of deep, unnatural chill that settled in the bones rather than the air. Beside her, Mark slept soundly, his slow, steady breathing the only noise. Except it wasn't the only noise. She sat up, straining to listen. They're so faint it could have been imagined a piano. Not a full melody, just scattered notes, hesitant, as though someone were testing the keys. She knew, without a doubt, where the sound was coming from. The sitting room. A deep sense of dread coiled inside her, but she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet hitting the cool wooden floor. She didn't wake Mark. She didn't know why, perhaps because she was still clinging to the desperate hope that this was nothing, that it would stop if she didn't acknowledge it. The house was utterly silent as she moved through it, every step stretching out, elongated by the shadows that pooled in the corners of the hallways. The door to the sitting room stood open. She could see the piano in the moonlight, its sleek black surface gleaming faintly. The music had stopped. Evelyn hesitated at the threshold, her breath coming quick and shallow. And then, with slow, deliberate precision, one of the keys pressed down on its own. A single note. The sound rang through the empty house, impossibly loud. Evelyn's heart lurched. Her breath hitched in her throat, but she couldn't move, couldn't turn away. The air around her was thick with something unseen, something waiting. Another note, and then another. Not random this time. Pattern. A melody. The same one she had played before. Her knees nearly buckled. She wanted to run to wake Mark, to leave this place and never return, but something kept her rooted in place. A pull, gentle yet insistent. The same pull she had felt the first time she sat at the piano. The first time her fingers had found those impossible notes. Her hands trembled as she reached for the piano lid. Slowly, she lifted it. Silence. The keys were still. The air in the room shifted, almost imperceptibly, as though something had just moved past her. Then, in the vast hush of the empty house, a whisper so soft she might have imagined it, but she didn't. Finish it. Evelyn's breath caught. The whisper had no source, no body, no shape, but it was real, and it was waiting. Evelyn stood frozen, her pulse a staccato rhythm against the thick silence that had settled over the room. The whisper still clung to the air, dissolving like mist, but the weight of its meaning remained. Finish it. The words echoed through her mind, intertwining with the melody she could still hear, even though the piano was now silent. She backed away, step by step, her breath shallow, her skin tingling with the sensation of being watched. The darkness in the corners of the room felt thicker, heavier, as if something was just beyond the reach of sight. Her own reflection in the piano's polished surface seemed unfamiliar, paler, more hollow, as though she were the ghost here, not whatever presence lingered. When she turned, she half expected to see something standing in the doorway, blocking her escape. But there was nothing, just the long hallway stretching into the darkness, lined with shadows that seemed deeper than before. She forced herself to move, slipping out of the room, her hands clammy against the cool wooden railing as she hurried up the stairs. Each step groaned beneath her weight, too loud in the oppressive stillness of the house. Mark was still asleep when she reached their bedroom, his back rising and falling with steady, peaceful breaths. The normalcy of it was almost enough to convince her that she had imagined it all. Almost. She climbed into bed without a sound, curling beneath the blankets, but sleep did not come. She lay still, eyes open, staring at the faint sliver of moonlight that cut across the ceiling. Every muscle in her body was tense, listening, waiting. For what? She didn't know. The next morning, Evelyn said nothing. She moved through the house in a daze, drinking her coffee with hands that still felt cold, even though the sun streamed through the windows, bathing everything in warm, golden light. Mark chatted idly, oblivious, talking about a chapter he was struggling with, a character he couldn't quite shape. She nodded along, giving the right responses, but her mind was elsewhere. The piano sat in the other room, silent now, but it wasn't gone. She could feel it, like an unfinished sentence, like a held breath. The whisper had asked her to finish it. But finish what? The thought haunted her throughout the day. It followed her as she folded laundry, as she stood at the kitchen sink, staring out at the quiet yard. It was still with her that evening, as the light dimmed and shadows stretched long across the walls. And then she heard it again. Not the whisper this time. Music. Not from the piano, but somewhere else fainter, more distant, like a radio playing from another room. She turned, heart hammering. The sound was familiar. A song she knew. A song the world knew. All by myself. But the voice was different. It wasn't the polished studio version the one millions had heard. This was raw, unfiltered, as if someone were singing it right there in the house, their voice carrying through the walls. Evelyn's breath caught. She followed the sound, step by step, through the quiet house, the air pressing heavy against her skin. It led her to the study Mark's study. The door was ajar. She hesitated, her fingers hovering just above the wood. The music was louder now, clearer. And then just as suddenly as it had begun it stopped. Evelyn pushed the door open. Mark was sitting at his desk, his back to her, the computer screen glowing in the dim room. He hadn't noticed her. She took a step inside. Mark! He flinched, turning too quickly, his expression tense. His eyes flicked toward the computer, and for the briefest moment, Evelyn saw it an open document, words hastily typed, words that shouldn't have been there. You hear it too, don't you? Then, just as quickly, he closed the screen. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Mark had heard it, and he had been trying to hide it. Evelyn stared at Mark, her breath shallow, her fingers tightening around the edge of the doorframe. The study felt smaller than before, the walls pressing inward, the air thick with something unseen. You hear it too, don't you? She said softly. Mark exhaled, rubbing his temples. He didn't look at her right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, his face pale in the dim glow of the computer screen. I didn't want to say anything, he admitted, voice low. I thought maybe I was just imagining things. But it's been happening for weeks. Evelyn swallowed. What's been happening? Mark hesitated, then opened the laptop again. The screen cast eerie shadows across his face as he scrolled through the document. She stepped closer, heart pounding as she read the words. They weren't Mark's usual writing. They weren't part of any book he had been working on. They were song lyrics, half-finished lines, fragmented verses, scattered thoughts that didn't belong to him. Some were familiar snippets of old Eric Carmen songs, but slightly altered, incomplete. Others were entirely unknown, raw and unfinished, as if someone had been trying to compose something new. I wake up some mornings and find these on my screen, Mark said. I don't remember typing them. Sometimes I'll sit down to write, and before I know it, I'm writing this instead. Like something's guiding my hands. He let out a short, nervous laugh. I sound insane. Evelyn shook her head. She didn't think he was insane. She thought of the whisper, of the phantom hands pressing the piano keys in the night, of the music that had found her fingers when she sat at the piano, as if it had been waiting for someone to play it. Finish it. The words echoed through her mind again, and this time she understood. It's him, she murmured. It's Eric. Mark scoffed. Come on, Evelyn. He never finished his last song. She turned to him, her pulse hammering with certainty. Don't you see? That's what all of this is. The piano, the whispers, the lyrics. He's still here because something was left undone. Mark shook his head, standing up. Even if that were true, even if what are we supposed to do? Just write the song for him. He let out another humorless laugh, but Evelyn didn't flinch. Yes, she said. Mark stared at her. Evelyn didn't blink. We finish it. That night, Evelyn sat at the piano. The house was silent, as if listening. Mark sat beside her, a notebook open in his lap, a pen poised in his fingers. For a moment, there was nothing. No cold spots, no flickering lights, no whispers. Just Evelyn, her hands hovering over the keys, waiting. Then, slowly, she began to play. The melody came easily, as if it had always been there, waiting beneath the surface, waiting to be heard. Mark scribbled words as they came, never pausing to think, letting the lyrics flow as naturally as the music. The air in the room grew warmer, lighter. Something shifted. The shadows in the corners of the room softened. The heaviness that had pressed against the house for weeks lifted, like a held breath finally released. Evelyn played the final note. Silence settled over them, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It was peaceful now, empty in a way that felt whole rather than haunted. Mark let out a breath, looking around. "Do you feel that?" Evelyn nodded. She did. The house was empty, truly empty. Eric Carmen was gone. His song was finished. Months later, when Evelyn and Mark moved out, the house remained quiet. The next owners never reported strange occurrences. No whispers in the night. No phantom melodies drifting through the halls. But sometimes, just sometimes, when Evelyn sat at her new piano in their new home, she would find her fingers moving without thought, playing a tune she didn't remember learning. And in those moments, she swore she could hear a voice, faint, distant, but unmistakably content. Quiet, lingering thank you, and then nothing at all. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.